Mr. President, I come to the floor today to strongly support the legislation called the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act. You know, with all that we have seen in the Gulf Coast over the past several weeks, I have to say I am more committed than ever in moving forward on three fronts now to protect our taxpayers, our families, and all of our workers across the country. First of all, I'm going to keep working to hold BP accountable and make sure that taxpayers in Washington State and across the country are not left holding the bag for this devastation. And this is exactly what the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act is going to do. Secondly, I'm going to fight to guarantee that what we are seeing in the Gulf Coast is never allowed to happen on the West Coast. And third, I'm going to make sure that BP and Transocean and all industry owners and operators are doing everything possible to protect their workers and make sure tragedies like this don't ever happen again. Because, Mr. President, here are the facts. On April 20th, 2010, there was a massive blowout and explosion on a BP oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. 11 workers are still missing and presumed dead, 17 more injured. That explosion caused a gushing spill that has now poured hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil into the Gulf and threatens still to spill millions more. It has, as we all know, created an environmental and economic tragedy, the magnitude of which we are only just beginning to comprehend. It's threatening entire communities and industry. And now the oil and chemical dispersants that are being sprayed into the Gulf have the potential to kill underwater wildlife and create underwater dead zones for decades to come. Those are the facts. Now, Mr. President, the questions are, who should be responsible for this cleanup and who should bear the burden for Big Oil's mistakes? Should it be the taxpayers, families, and small business owners who are already being asked to bear so much today? Or should it be the companies responsible for this spill, including BP, a company that, by the way, made $6.1 billion profit in the very first 3 months of 2010 alone? Well, Mr. President, I co-sponsored the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act because, to me, the answer is pretty clear. I believe that BP needs to be held accountable for the environmental and economic damage of this spill, and I'm going to fight to make sure that taxpayers do not end up losing a single dime to pay for the mess that this big oil company created. To me, this is really an issue of fundamental fairness. If an oil company causes a spill, they should be the one to clean it up and pay for it, not taxpayers. This bill that I'm talking about this evening eliminates the current $75 million cap on oil company liability so that taxpayers will never be left holding the bag for Big Oil's mistakes. Straightforward, common sense, and it's fair. And I have to say, Mr. President, I am extremely disappointed that this common sense bill continues to be blocked by some Republicans every time we bring it up. But I want you to know I'm going to keep fighting for the Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act to pass, and I'm going to keep fighting so that families and taxpayers in Washington State and across the country don't end up holding the bag on this. Because the bottom line is this: oil companies are going to make billions of dollars in profits when times are good. They should not be allowed to leave taxpayers hanging when they create a problem. The Big Oil Bailout Prevention Act writes this common sense policy into law, and I urge every senator to side with our taxpayers and support this important legislation. But, Mr. President, I don't think that's enough. I've always been opposed to drilling off the coast of my home state of Washington, and this tragedy is just one more very painful reminder of the potential consequences of opening up our West Coast to drilling. The economic and environmental devastation that was caused by the Exxon Valdez disaster 20 years ago now is still impacting industry in my home state of Washington. Our coastal region supports over 150,000 jobs, and it generates almost $10 billion in economic activity, all of which would be threatened if drilling were to happen off our West Coast. That's why I'm going to keep fighting for legislation that bans drilling off the West Coast and makes sure that big oil companies are never allowed to roll the dice with Washington State's economy and our environment. Mr. President, we need to hold big oil accountable, and we need to make sure that disasters like this never happen again. But we also have to remember the workers who were killed and injured in this horrible tragedy. We cannot forget that this is an issue that is larger than this one tragedy. The entire oil and gas industry has a deplorable record of worker and workplace safety. We have got to make sure that every worker is treated properly and protected, and that companies that mistreat their workers are held accountable. Mr. President, we know that the oil industry is able to operate under stricter safety standards and regulations because they are already doing just that in Europe and in Australia, and even in Contra Costa County, California, where the county has a set of stricter guidelines that have now reduced injuries and fatality rates. But we also know that worker safety should not be measured just by injury rates. We should be looking at reducing dangerous conditions like fires or hazardous spills or releases of toxic gases. And then when accidents do happen, we've got to record them, we need to learn from them, and we need to build on a program to prevent them from ever happening again. And we need to make sure that our workers are treated with respect and their rights are protected. So, Mr. President, that is exactly why I am so concerned about the recent reports of very callous and unacceptable treatment of Transocean workers in the hours following that April 20th explosion. Those reports suggest that Transocean put their bottom line above safety standards, above environmental impact, and the well-being of their workers. So, Mr. President, I have called on the company to release copies of legal waivers that surviving crew members of the Deepwater Horizon were reportedly forced to sign following that oil rig explosion. And I am going to stay on top of this to make sure that Transocean produces those requested documents so we can get to the bottom of exactly how this situation was handled. You know, workers everywhere ought to be confident that their employers are putting their safety first, and that companies that betray that trust have to be held accountable. So, Mr. President, I'm going to work to make sure that happens, and I'm going to continue fighting to keep drilling away from the Washington State coastline, and I'm going to keep pushing for this bill to make sure taxpayers don't have to pay for big oil's mistakes. Mr. President, anyone deciding whether or not to support this legislation ought to ask themselves a few simple questions. Who are you fighting for? Who are you trying to help? Are you here to protect and shield big oil companies? Or are you going to fight for our families and our taxpayers? I support this legislation because, to me, the answer is pretty clear. And I urge all of our colleagues to allow this bill to pass so that our taxpayers in my home state of Washington and across the country can be protected. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.